Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this morning with this really timely, I think, briefing on a post-mortem of COP26. I called it post-mortem because it does look like somebody died, but actually it could be just a terminal patient. And in fact, could be coming back to life very soon, depending on what lovely experts that join us today will say. So of course, you know Nick Mabey. He is the CEO and co-founder of E3G, one of the world's most important climate think tanks. And we're also joined by an incredible panel of experts who will possibly be answering all our questions on what really happened in Glasgow. So we've got Camilla Fenning, who is an expert on the coal and fossil fuel transition, Iskander Erzini Vernoit, I think the pronunciation is, Iskander, I'm not sure, but you're the expert on climate finance, and then of course Alex Scott on climate diplomacy. So we're kicking off with Nick, who's got some slides for us as well. Nick, it's over to you.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks so much for hosting this. We did a lot of briefings before COP, and so I thought it would be useful to go back to what we said. I always like to go back and slightly test our claims. So I'm going to give a bit of a structured overview of what happened, how it ranked against the benchmarks which we and the COP presidency was setting before Glasgow, which sometimes get forgotten in the melee of all the action, and then a brief outline of where we're going next, and then the others will kind of fill in the dots and we'll take your questions collectively. So, just to remind ourselves, what did we have to do? We had to show Glasgow was making this Paris ambition cycle set up in 2015 work, and that governments were taking their promises seriously by submitting new pledges in advance of the conference. But it also needed to respond to the worsening science and global climate disasters, particularly in 2021 we saw, and we needed to finalize key elements of the rules around Paris, particularly on transparency around what countries do and emissions trading. And so what was actually agreed at COP26, so it's called the Glasgow Climate Pact, sort of formal decisions which now become part of the formal regime. So particularly the agenda mandates, agenda on the rule book and Article 6, which become part of the kind of long-term rules. And then I suppose the surprise package, though we knew it was going to try to happen, was this new cover texts, as they were called, basically political declarations included in the outcome, which give forward commitments for additional action on mitigation, adaptation and finance. And that was the real innovation for this conference. It's like combining a G20 with a UN negotiation. We also saw lots of countries coming forward with plurilateral initiatives on coal, methane, fossil fuel finance, deforestation, vehicle phase out, which were meant to show more ambition. And it set a really aggressive agenda of work beyond 2022 to potentially, hopefully deliver a COP26, 7 higher NDCs, a global goal on adaptation. We'll be halfway through a new negotiation on global finance goal, which will be super controversial, and then potentially work on loss and damage. So actually a huge amount was done. It was always a pivot. The question was it pivot enough to more action? So what were the metrics we set? We said, firstly, Glasgow wasn't Paris. What Glasgow was about was saying, where have we got to, adjudication, and launchpad, how can we accelerate out to get nearer the goals we delivered? So that was it. Are we delivering? What's our forward ambition and acceleration? And this big benchmark set by the UK, one was to ensure 1.5 degrees would credibly be within reach inside the 2020s. Secondly, that the global finance promised to countries was delivered, and particularly to protect countries from climate impacts. And thirdly, they wanted some global deals to make global coal history and begin to show a tangible transition out of fossil fuels. So those were their top lines. But another way of thinking about it, particularly if you're kind of more political, is about this COP needed to cement the credibility of the Paris climate regime, which was, for all of the hoopla when it was agreed, still a very weak and compromised statement. So with leaders, at the end of COP, would they believe the Paris process effective and fair? Fair is critical for preserving their prosperity and security, or would they seek other remedies, perhaps through the International Court of Justice? And does the regime have the support of the major powers? Do we think it's underpinned by geopolitics? Would investors think that the move to net zero global economy was inevitable? Will they believe that if they invest in any new fossil fuels investments, it'll be stranded beyond 2025? So they believe they're real financial risk. That's a tangible metric. And would the public believe leaders are serious about limiting climate change? And would they believe other countries would deliver their fair share of action and so support more action at home? So these are the kind of political metrics outside the policy metrics which we're looking at. So did we deliver? So what were the pledges going into COP26? Well, most of the developed countries announced new targets that were broadly aligned with net zero by 2050. China didn't. That was a big surprise coming in. It has a 2060 goal, but its 2030 target isn't compatible with that. It did publish more concrete implementation plans. The other surprise was India announcing a net zero 2070 goal, but perhaps more importantly, its 2030 action on particularly increasing renewables was a big boost to the conference at the beginning. We had some backsliders. Australia's net zero pamphlet was not credible. Brazil and Mexico weakened their targets, but then we had some surprises the other way, with Nigeria and Kenya, for example, stepping up with conditional net zero goals. So we now have 90% of global GDP covered by net zero goals, but they have very different quality, and the 2030 targets associated with aren't mostly strong enough to deliver. And that's what leads us to the verdict. And you may have seen this from Climate Action Tracker. So what do we pledge to? Well, Paris left us way away from the safe zone. And the policies and actions countries have put in place, the first blue bar, have given us some chance of staying below that, but only a bit. The 2030 targets we saw going into COP, if they're all delivered, will get us to around 2.4 degrees with obviously a range around it, starting to get there. If you add on the pledges and targets, including some of those methane pledges and other issues, just in the 2030s, is just looking at 2030, you're starting to push down to 2.1. You're starting to get into the well below 2 range, the first target of COP. If you then add in all the 2050 targets, which is what they here call the optimistic scenario, you'll be getting nearer to 1.5. So essentially, if all the countries submitted net zero targets aligned their 2030 action with that, we'd be getting near to keeping 1.5 there, but we still need to have to go a bit further. So we made really significant progress in Glasgow, but not enough to feasibly say 1.5 is alive without more work on ambition in the 2030s. The second big one, making coal history. Well, who had to do it? China's half of coal, to remind you. The rest of the world, dark blue is all the coal plants in the world on this graph in those little squares of things that are working and need to be phased out, and the brighter colors are planned plants. So did we make coal history? There was a huge reduction in proposed power plants, 76% drop since Paris. All G20 countries agreed this year not to stop financing international coal power. They removed support for over 40 gigawatts. The rest of the power plants, most of it's in a few countries, we saw big proposals, so Indonesia, Vietnam in particular, promising net zero goals that would phase out coal power, but they want financing. India's new NDC has no space for coal power in the 2020s. But again, it needs financing. China did not agree to reduce coal use faster and did not agree on unabated coal. But basically, overall, we had the South African package of 8.5 billion, really important. So, and then finally, the drama on the last night of agreed.
Nick, I think you've frozen.
It's also frozen for everyone. Yeah. I could always step in on the coal points if that's helpful.
Yes, yes, please. And we'll try to get Nick back in a usable way. Over to you, Camilla. Thank you.
Sure. Well, it follows up. Oh, is that Nick back?
I am back. Sorry, I don't, that was just a random piece of technological fail. So let me get it back. So, can you hear me now?
Tiziana, I think we can hear your microphone, but not Nick's.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That's fine, cool. So sorry about that. So again, so we've made a huge amount of progress to begin concerning coal to history, but we'll need to build on 2022, particularly on coal phase out. So, you know, some big progress, but not enough. So if we look through the benchmarks we set in terms of that, would we respond to the code red warning and keep 1.5 alive? delivering on the Paris promises with our first pillar. Did countries deliver the 100 billion? Well, yes, but late, and they need to do more to show they're delivering that. Particular focus on the US. There was this great pledge to double adaptation finance by 2025. We did agree a robust Paris rulebook, and there's a new UN Secretary General task force looking at the environmental integrity of business pledges. That's really, really critical. Ambition, really interesting. NDC increases were well short. We did a lot of other things, particularly I think this 32 countries agreed to stop public fossil finance in 2022. That's 25 billion a year, not going to fossil. Some other big pledges which did bridge the gap more and showed real focus. And then the thing that was a really high risk play, the 1.5 acceleration package, we've got that COP decision to revisit net zero strategies and NDCs next year. And we also have a dialogue on loss and damage, which may conclude next year in COP26. So I think the pledges, is 1.5 a lie? Well, the doors kept open, I think is what everybody's basically saying. We did see a lot of progress. We did see pushback from China on 1.5 as a primary goal, despite the US-China piece. India is not clear it wants to do it. Keeping the door open by the 2022, but I think that's crunch moment in 2022 is now set up, which is quite a fundamentally different dynamic coming out of a COP where everybody usually collapses. So the question is that going to work? Is this process of coming back next year to try and bridge all these gaps, build on the progress we've made today, going to work? So last one, so what's the dynamic coming out of COP? We had a surprise US-China cooperation agreement that really helped lower the geopolitical tensions, which in the middle of the week was starting to really build up. We're starting to see a real blame game between Biden and Xi. I think that gives us confidence the Paris Agreement won't be derailed by major power politics. So it was a truce rather than a foundation. But it's a really important signal that this regime is now supported by the two major powers. And China is now under super pressure from high developing countries, particularly following its endgame weakening for the coal phase out tax. That was another big dynamic, new dynamic in the room. The kind of failure to deliver 100 billion on time did undermine the adaptation, the high ambition coalition, which was the drive of the real glue that stuck Glasgow together. That trust was partly rebuilt by the doubling adaptation finance process, but the US in particular has to show they're delivering on this. No one's quite sure Congress will agree this money. So that's still kind of jeopardy about whether this high ambition coalition that drove Glasgow is going to stick together. And then loss and damage, giving countries support who are damaged by endgame. There was a really bad endgame play there. The EU, US and Japan just pushed back and refused to consider a new finance facility. They have to shift on that next year. They have to support this new IMF trust fund on resilience. So that's a real task that the big developed countries have to take home. They can't just say no all the time. I think we saw a huge increase in investor confidence underneath all the political wrangling. Actually, a huge number of CEOs, huge number of Davos on the Clyde, but also huge pushback on greenwash. As a key theme of COP26, are these targets worth the paper they're printed on? So this new UN Secretary General panel, which will implement next year, is absolutely going to be critical to driving up credible action and making these investor and business commitments seem good. But I think we did see a sea change in investor moods. All of this just reflects in the public mood coming out, which is very mixed between the kind of failure, blah, 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 big despair, big calls for direct action. So I think this is very much in the balance with the public about whether this made the difference it needed. And they're right, it didn't make all the difference, but it really pushed to a crunch next year. And I think the critical path to NDC increases next year will be getting big clean energy deals coming with India, Indonesia, Vietnam, building on the South Africa model. That's what Boris Johnson said in his statement. We've also seen it from other leaders. To do this, we're going to have to see some real reforms in international financing. German G7 is going to be critical. It's one of the big things we'll pick up in the conversation, but there's a lot to be done to actually make countries think they can deliver more next year. It's not just about asking them again, it's about changing the political context and when that can happen. So COP26 was incredibly unique compared to other ones in driving this emergency plan of action in 2022, which the UK has got to take forward as COP president, but it's going to need the support of Europe and US much more than it got, particularly from the EU this year, if it's going to deliver something that does credibly keep 1.5 within reach by the end of next year.
Thank you very much for that, Nick. Camilla, I think that it's your turn to tell us about coal and fossil fuel a little bit more in depth.
Thank you very much. And I would say that this is an historic moment on coal, and that COP26 has set down a clear marker that coal power is heading for the exit. I think it's marked now as a dangerous emitter whose days are numbered. I don't think any leader, citizen, business or market can now ignore this clear message. And as all the sort of national leaders come back from Glasgow, I think national policies will need to plot a trajectory for the pathway out of coal, and investors will be looking at that and clamouring to get their money out. And just to set the broader context, it's not just in Glasgow that this has been happening. I think 2021 has seen a series of firsts. Coal exit was discussed for the first time by leaders at G7 and G20 as well. So there's been a huge amount of combined UK-Italian diplomacy, which I think has really made a difference. And coal is now inescapable for leaders. It can't be pushed under the carpet anymore. For example, this is the first time that coal was directly referenced in a COP agreement. That sets a precedent. So already we're looking at, what could we say on coal in COP27? And it also puts the pressure on oil and gas as well. Talking about the sort of phase down language, I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, but just to say that China's acceptance of phase down language explicitly for coal powered generation is a first. Previously, they've made more generic references to coal consumption rather than coal powered generation. So that may have got lost a bit, but I think that's really important. And that increases the spotlight on China's approach to limiting domestic new coal capacity growth and accelerating retirement, and looks at the potential for having some kind of no new net coal as a first step under the current 5-year plan. And similarly, India had always previously shied away from explicit references to coal. We've seen this in a lot of interactions with India. So actually willingness to accept phase down, even if not phase out, was, we think, a major step forward and will provide space for further domestic discussion of the power sector pathways and the bad economics of new coal, which were very applicable in India. Phase down is less definitive than phase out, but it's a clear trajectory. And I think it's quite instructive to turn it around and not focus quite so much on India, as well as focusing on India and China and the fact that they did slightly dilute it, but to turn it around and highlight all the countries who were prepared to include phase out in the text. So that included Australia, included Japan, included South Korea, Indonesia, Colombia. There's a massive list of countries that were prepared to put their name at Glasgow on phase down. So that is really, truly significant. And I think it's important that that's not lost. And actually, I don't know how many of you were sort of like watching live minute by minute as the plenary sort of unfolded. And there was this, debate around whether it was going to be no coal in the statement at all, phase down or phase out. But I think that debate in full public view did have the positive effect of massively heightening its climate significance and its sort of significance to keeping 1.5 alive. And today's headlines worldwide really are flagging the centrality of coal exit in terms of our sort of critical path to end global warming. So I think that's incredibly important. Of course, countries such as India found it difficult to admit definitively the end of coal. But phase down is progress, and from our point of view, we believe that it's a temporary placeholder for phase out. And just looking at India, and as Nick has mentioned, India did make some ambitious commitments elsewhere at COP, for example, having 50% renewable energy in its electricity mix by 2030, and its other sort of 5 elexes. And actually, the cost of renewables coming down and market forces will actually hasten the end of coal in any case. I think it's important to note the other additions to the text later in the day on just transition. I think that was an important addition by India and I think possibly South Africa, which highlighted the support needed for coal communities. And I think that's an area where there needs to be more work by developed countries in terms of how they support that just transition. I think we've focused a lot on the actual text, but just to mention some of the other COP announcements on coal, which are important. There's the South Africa $8.5 billion deal. There's the extension of the Energy Transition Council, announcement of the Climate Investment Fund Accelerating Coal Transition Programme, which has its first projects in South Africa, India, notably, Indonesia and the Philippines, and the Asian Development Bank Energy Transition Mechanism. So lots of work happening alongside the actual negotiations on coal, both in terms of phasing down, helping retirement, and trying to enable countries to sign up to no new coal as well. And a number of countries signed up to the Global Coal to Clean Power Transition Statement, over 40 of them. That secured signals on coal phase out within certain timeframes. So, for example, South Korea, Indonesia, and Vietnam signed up to that, as well as Europe's second and third largest coal users, Poland and Ukraine. And a number of countries under that statement also committed to no new coal, including Vietnam, Morocco, Egypt, and Chile. And so by the end of COP, I think there were at least 60 countries that had made a commitment to no new coal, and that's significant. I think I'll stop there. Happy to give any detail on that in the questions afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Camilla. We can go to Iskander. If you can unmute yourself, possibly come on camera and give us your opening remarks, please.
Hello there, and good morning to everyone from Glasgow, where I'm just outside the station. Hopefully audible despite the background noise. So I'm going to be saying a few words on finance, which Nick touched upon, but really was at the core of the COP in many different ways. Finance is obviously was key to the contention in the latter stages of the COP, but was also there from the very outset in the beginning. So finance was put front and center by the world leaders in the first 2 days of the COP. We had a number of heads of state and government, both from developed and developing countries, signaling the need to marshal trillions as necessary to deliver climate goals. I think with 1.5, keeping 1.5 alive being the headline for the COP, we did see at COP, I think for the first time, a reflection on what that would entail in terms of scaling financial flows, but also reforms to the financial architecture to deliver said flows. We had Angela Merkel acknowledge the scaling in clean energy finance that would be required on the order of trillions. We had also Mario Draghi talking about the international financial architecture with a particular focus on reforming the multilateral development banks. And he also proposed a task force in this respect. So I think it's at the leaders level, COP26 provided a launching point for hopefully the more substantive conversation that we absolutely have to have in 2022 on scaling financial flows that should cut through both the G7 and the G20. In the same vein, it was also noteworthy to see the launch of the Clean and Green initiative under the G7 Build Back Better for the World initiative, or B3W. And the sums behind that were fairly modest, but it sort of signaled an approach towards shifting much larger private finance flows, which needs to be replicated at scale. Obviously, commitments by the UK in this regard were overshadowed by the aid cuts, but I think more broadly, there's I think a clearer agenda emerging around the need to both recapitalize and reform the multilateral development banks. So that was at the first 2 days of the conference, and then that segued very cleanly into the Wednesday, which was Finance Day at COP, where you had essentially the larger part of the world's private financial sector committing to net zero under Mark Carney's Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero. There was much ado about the fact that it was 135 trillion. The headline statement, I think, from Mark Carney was that the money was there and it just had to be leveraged into solving climate change. This was met with some pushback, given the fact that the 135 trillion assembled is the stock of assets that the financial institutions committed to net zero are responsible for, but does not necessarily translate into flows. There's a commitment in principle from those institutions to do a lot more in investing in some of these key emerging and developing country markets that are so crucial from the standpoint of changing emissions trajectories and cutting fossil fuel consumption in line with 1.5. But at the end of the day, they were commitments in principle, and bring those actors in will be conditional upon the types of actions being sought by governments, by the private finance sector in 2022, with a lot of specificity increasingly around an agenda for de-risking and risk sharing through things like platforms that can bring together public and private finance for blending, focusing on key countries or key investment thematics or key geographies more broadly. I think it nevertheless signals a huge turning point, though, that would have been incomprehensible in terms of the private sector's approaches to climate change just a few years back. And this is the culmination of 2 years of steady but transformative shifting at the boardroom level and with commitments to net zero. I think finance flows aside, the fact that the financial sector is committed to net zero in such a huge way is going to be very consequential in terms of the ownership of the companies that they have in their portfolios. And so I think that we should expect to see that being reflected in a step change in terms of corporate governance and active ownership. The following day, there was a quite significant development moving on to public finance with commitments by over 30 governments and public finance actors to cease fossil finance and pivot to clean energy finance by the end of 2022. So that is not only unprecedented in terms of the depth of the ambition and the sort of stringency of the commitment, but also in terms of the breadth of the actors that it assembled, with much of Western Europe and North American countries, the US, Canada, and some countries that hadn't been expected to have signed on to this statement did do so in the final hours. And indeed, after the launch event, significantly a number of countries that hadn't met the rush to meet the deadline for the launch signed on in the following days, like the Netherlands and Germany. I think this is quite significant because it's an active effort towards ending international public fossil finance subsidies, which these investments are in effect. But it also crucially pivots them towards clean energy, and so that's a boost to international climate finance that would count under the 100 billion and beyond the 100 billion. So Nick mentioned the 100 billion, and obviously that has been the elephant in the room for finance issues under the COP process for the past 10 years. But surprisingly, perhaps, the 100 billion didn't figure as significantly as many might have prognosticated. I think that was due in part to the pivot that has been mentioned to discussing the much larger sums required in the trillions, not only for mitigation and decarbonization, but for adaptation and for dealing with the costs of losses and damages.
Iskander, sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to ask you, please wrap up your initial remarks, because these are initial remarks, otherwise we don't have any time for questions. And I do want Alex Scott to also give us a couple of thoughts, if you don't mind.
Very good. No, I can wrap up in the next 30 seconds, if that's all right. So just to reiterate, there was a commitment to a doubling on adaptation finance, which is hugely significant. And from the standpoint of the goodwill of the African countries and the vulnerable island states was crucial to bring the deal over the line. There wasn't a commitment to new finance in a serious way for loss and damage, but there was a commitment to a process towards that. And while that was met with some skepticism by civil society, it was sufficient to get the deal over the line with respect to the vulnerable countries, parties at the table. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alex, I know that we are sort of slightly over the half-hour mark that we sort of had in our minds to start questions, but please do come in. You're going to talk a little bit about climate diplomacy. I do want some of your remarks before we kick off with the questions.
Of course. I'll try and be brief. I'll give you a quick rundown on who the key players were in the dynamics of the 2 weeks at the COP, and then I'll summarize with kind of 3 big political shifts that we'll really be watching how they play out into next year. So starting with the key players, I think the most important player from the beginning of the 2 weeks were the small islands in the High Ambition Coalition. They brought the High Ambition Coalition together, and the star power of Mia Mottley, the Barbadian Prime Minister's speech at the start of the World Leaders Summit, really injected a sense of ambition into the political dynamics at the COP. And we saw that play out over the 2 weeks, where they really retained the leadership of the High Ambition Coalition. And we didn't see as much leadership coming from the European Union as we would typically expect within that High Ambition Coalition. It wasn't so much coming from the Commission side, but definitely more from a small number of the smaller European countries working closely with the small island developing states in particular within that high ambition grouping, particularly Ireland and Spain playing a lot of the connectivity role behind the scenes. We saw the Netherlands and Germany playing a little bit of that role as well, but they're obviously more hamstrung by the domestic political situations with coalition negotiations ongoing in their countries at home. But what was quite surprising was seeing that the Commission and France weren't really there as a really vocal player in the high ambition grouping. That was something we definitely noticed at this COP. Italy played a little bit of that role, but were very much more in the little brother role to the UK as presidency over the 2 weeks. The other big splash came from India, starting with that net zero commitment at the beginning of the COP, which really shifted the dynamics completely and shifted the dynamics from a real battle between developed and developing countries on who's responsible for taking the big action to everybody is responsible for taking action to reduce emissions. So they played a really important role at the start of the COP and then flipped it on its head by the end of the COP, playing that role as the kind of cover for the lower ambition coalition, pushing back against some of the text that was going to be in the final decision. Obviously, that wasn't just India. India was just the vocal voice of it. It was a coalition, not so much a coalition, but it was an alliance between India and China to push back on that, on the way that the coal language was going to land in the final decision text. So it'll be interesting to see next year how India and China make up for that role that they played at the end of the COP. We saw a lot of disappointment coming from the high ambition island states vocally on the floor of the plenary. So that will be a key one to watch. But for India, it'll be key to watch also how the money shifts around deals like the country-led South Africa deal to support the transition in India to meet this very considerably ambitious. It sounds less ambitious, 2070 net zero for India, but considerably ambitious for the stage of development that India is at. The other players to note were the US and China, but the way that I've been noting them is not as big of a player vocally, publicly, and visibly in the COPs this year. The US-China cooperation deal was clearly a shift in the way that they manage their relationship on the global stage, but it didn't progress or have as much of an impact on the final COP outcome as a US-China dynamic has had on the COPs in the past. The key shift from that partnership was more around how the US changed their political rhetoric around loss and damage and no longer holding up any kind of COP level negotiations or discussions on loss and damage. The final key player I think is worth commenting on is the UN Secretary General and his team, taking a much stronger and tougher stance in the political dynamics of this COP, from Selwyn Hart kind of almost berating the World Bank in the FT, to Guterres very much taking the line of the youth movement and talking about the disappointment as the overwhelming outcome from on the kind of pace of change that was delivered from this COP. So I think that'll be a key one to watch next year as well. The UNFCCC Executive Secretary didn't quite manage to bring the civil society movement to support the way that they were trying to manage the inclusion and access to the negotiating rooms. So that will be another key one to watch on the UNFCCC side next year, where the term for the executive secretary is up next year. So there will be a process to work out who is going to take the helm of the UNFCCC. Then quickly, the three big political shifts that we will be watching next year. Firstly is that political recognition that more needs to be done to get to the 1.5 degree pathway. And that means the acknowledgement that that 1.5 degree pathway is the one that we need to get to, and the recognition that all countries need to do more to get there. We had a few key commitments on coal, cash, cars and trees, the taglines at this COP. What we'll need to be watching next year is the accountability to the commitments that came out of the world leaders segment and the themed days of the 2 weeks at COP, ensuring that they are delivered and that there is process behind them, not just political commitment. And then delivering on the decisions from the COP cover text to come back with more ambition in their 2030 targets. The second big political shift was around the shift in talking about loss and damage, a clear shift in how developed countries acknowledge the support and solidarity that they need to be offering to developing countries. And as Nick said, we didn't get everything that the islands were asking for, in particular on loss and damage, but we have got a significant change in the political conversation about how we deal with loss and damage, and that will play out in this dialogue that is the key outcome of the COP agreement on loss and damage. And we'll have in the COP record a clear acknowledgement of the island's understanding of what it means to have that political dialogue, and their understanding is that it leads to having a funding facility, or it leads to a clear discussion about what a funding facility looks like on loss and damage. The final political shift, I think, was cementing the role of COPs and climate politics and dynamics in the overall, as a kind of overall thread within global cooperation. And we saw that in China and the US using this COP as a stage to make a big announcement on their geopolitical relationship. And we saw that also in the kinds of things that Iskander was talking about, in the political recognition of the need to really reform how the global financial system works, not just for development, but also for dealing with climate change. And that will be another key thing to watch into 2022, how that plays out. What happens with Barbados's idea of $500 billion a year in special drawing rights from the IMF? What happens with the principles that the UK, US and EU have decided to set around having country-led approaches in their global infrastructure investment? Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I can see some of my colleagues are ready for the questions. I wanted to kick off with mine as usual, and it is about the EU's role, which has been said to be not as good as expected. They've been criticised for lacking leadership. So my question is really post-Brexit. I would like to ask, with the idea of, had Brexit not happened, would the UK have had a role in sort of convincing and working more effectively with the other EU partners? So was this a chance for the UK to shine post-Brexit? And also, why did the EU lack ambition, as most people would say? And if you could, if some of you experts could explain the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a little bit complex and has been attributed to possibly one of the reasons why the EU kept its head down, not wanting to discuss this contentious policy. Who wants to go for that?
Shall I just quickly start with the
Thank
EU?
you.
As someone who works, increasingly with them, and I think it was partly to do with Brexit. I think the UK was a major driver of European climate diplomacy. Of course, even if Brexit hasn't happened, it would still have been doing the presidency. So in the end, the EU would have had to work without it in terms of diplomacy. But I feel, it's a real shame that, with vaccine, I think van der Leyen was weakened by vaccine diplomacy. The Germans were in an election. The real puzzle is Macron. It was the Paris Agreement. We were told this was Macron's #1 political objective, but the French have been pretty absent all year, and pretty absent in COP. And the only interpretation people have given us from the inside is that Macron didn't want to give Boris Johnson a win, which, to be honest, given the importance of this issue, seems rather trivial as a reason not for turning up. So if Europe has done amazing work this year at home, but just doing really good things at home and policies at home isn't enough. You've got to be out there working, and that's certainly something we're looking for them to step up. And I know there's a lot of dissatisfaction inside the European Union for member states that they haven't performed at the level they want to, and we expect the new German government with its G7 next year to really be pushing Europe's game a lot worse. I don't think they were being silent because of CBAMs. The CBAM kind of carbon border adjustment is not really going to hit anybody till 2025, or even 2030 really. So it was a bit of a nothing this year. Diplomatically, it's being managed because it's so far away. But expect trade to be a big deal next year, but not the CBAM. The steel and aluminium deal they did with the US, much bigger. China's already focusing on that. It's got a green element, it's got a geopolitical element. So yeah, trade will be big on the agenda next year, just not CBAMs. There's plenty of other things coming up on the inside track.
Thank you very much for that. Masato, you were the first one, the quickest one with your yellow hand. Please unmute yourself, remind us who you work with, and go for it.
Thank you very much for very, very comprehensive presentation. I have two questions. One is coal and gas, and also hydrogen. And so unabated means very sensitive for Japan. Japan said mitigate coal power plant by using ammonia and hydrogen. But some said unabated means just CCS and CCUS. What do you think? And secondly, there is 3 types of hydrogen: brown, blue, green. And which hydrogen would be acceptable for international society?
Just on the unabated, it's quite detailed, and I know that this is an issue that perplexes Japan and is sometimes used as a sort of cover for Japan's statements on what it's going to do on coal. We've actually written a whole blog about it because it is extremely detailed. I'm very happy to send you those details after this, rather than maybe take up more time here, if that's acceptable.
Yes.
Thank you.
And
just on the Europe thing, I would also just go back to say that the EU did sign up to the Global Coal to Clean Power Statement, which makes them commit to coal phase out in the 2030s or as soon as possible thereafter. So that was the first time that the EU had made that commitment, and sort of points the finger at Poland. So that was something that is worth pointing out. And also just to mention sort of Timmermans' very impassioned plea from the floor of the plenary yesterday. I mean, maybe that was too little too late, I don't know, but certainly very much going along with the stronger coal language, even if it wasn't adopted at the very end. Thanks.
And so on oil and gas, I think two things. The statement on fossil fuel financing, which is now taking at least 24 billion a year out of fossil support by 32 countries, covers oil and gas investment, unless in very poor countries. So I think we're seeing a move against certainly any idea of brown hydrogen from gas. Blue hydrogen with CCS has to prove itself because there's no at scale promotion. So I think green hydrogen is what people are looking at the moment. I think this will become a very key point next year. One, there's a lot of issues around Africa and the use of gas in Africa and developments there and hydrogen. And also the UN Secretary General's panel, expert panel, is going to come up with transition pathways, which will look precisely at this issue of what's acceptable in a net zero pathway given by a bank or a company, and how will these issues around different types of hydrogen be counted in that. So yeah, very much a tough issue for next year and the year after to try and pin down these definitional issues and make sure greenwashing, I mean, greenwashing was one of the big themes in the public debate because there's too much of it. And the Secretary General's really made this one of his primary focuses coming out of COP to keep the credibility and integrity of this process going and not undermined by false claims.
Thank you. Jacqueline, you're next. If you want to ask your question, remind us who you work with.
Hi, it's Jacqueline Magnay. I'm from the Australian newspaper. I'm interested in your reaction within hours of the pact being handed down, that we had a minister in Australia say that phase down is an economic win for Australia, and that the energy minister said very clearly and bluntly that Australia will not be changing its targets nor its ambitions for next year. So I'm just wondering what the view of Australia has on the rest of the world and what impact this would have, if anything.
Come on, Alex, you've got to do it. You're the Australian on the panel.
So, I mean, Camilla can probably come in on the coal side of things, but I think what we got from this agreement is a political recognition globally that more needs to be done, and an agreement to request parties to come back with more ambitious 2030 NDCs. We didn't just get that request though, we got process behind it. So there will be now annual reports showing who has and who hasn't put forward more ambition and what that means for the global track record of getting closer to that 1.5 degree pathway. There will also be annual minister level roundtables, political level roundtables to talk about who is and isn't getting the world closer to that 1.5 degree pathway. So there's not just the request in that agreement, but there's also the political hooks to showcase where Australia is and isn't delivering on what has been agreed in this process.
And just to back that up, just so that it's not just the UN that will be looking at what Australia is doing. So the president of Ramaphosa of South Africa said very clearly in the FT, the reason they agreed this coal phase out deal was because they said they wouldn't be able to sell their goods or get foreign investment if they didn't align with Paris and phase out coal. Because of all those commitments by the private sector, the IMF is going to review every economic plan, including Australia's. So there is going to be huge pressure on any country who wants to see investment in global supply chains to show how they're going to provide clean power and a clean, sensible transition pathway. So Australia can say what it wants, but people don't have to invest in Australia. People don't have to buy Australian goods, and people don't have to buy Australian coal if they don't want to. So in the end, Australia is a demander on the rest of the economy, not a shaper of the rest of the global economy. Australians need to have a debate about whether this is a good plan for their future, or actually the current government's heading them into an economic cul-de-sac, because that's what all the other countries, including major fossil exporters like Nigeria, think, and they're coming forward with plans. Australia looks like a bit of an outlier nowadays and a backwater.
And on coal specifically at Glasgow, Australia did not sign up to any of the various initiatives on coal, whether that was the Global Coal to Clean Power Statement. And, you know, people could pick a mix. People could have just signed up to the renewable energy and the just transition section of those, for example, rather than just the no new coal and the global phase out. But Australia didn't sign up to anything, or any of the sort of no new coal compact, for example, that was launched at the UN previously. Having said that, it did not put up its flag to say that it was against the phase out language in the final statement. It would have been happy to go ahead with the phase out language. So I think that's something that maybe can be kind of teased out and mentioned in good circumstances. Thanks.
Thank you.
Vitas, it's your turn.
Hi, it's a question to Nick and Alex, and I'm Vitas Sudachis from Televisa Mexican TV. You know, we heard a lot before the COP, those British government repeating there's going to be cars, trees, coal and cash. So the cash segment of it, how damaging it's to the UK presidency that the cash was a failure. So no firm pledges for finance. And does it give ammunition to geopolitical rivals like China, saying, look, the West is preaching it, but it's not putting the money on the table? Thank you. So it's for Nick and Alex.
So to start, I mean, I think there actually has been some really, to be honest, poor reporting on the 100 billion. So we're currently probably around 95 billion after the pledges from this year, and the plan is to reach 100 billion either in 2022 or 23 and then exceed it afterwards. We'd hope to get language that they would basically pay their arrears on the 100 billion because they're arriving late over the period of 2025. I think they will achieve that in fact, but the Americans weren't prepared to sign up to it in words. So, and the reason why, as Iskander says, the small island states and vulnerables didn't make a fuss about the 100 billion was because they felt, you know, they were annoyed it was late, but they didn't see it as the kind of failure people are reporting it. It was stupid of the developed countries not to do it earlier. It was a ridiculously bad piece of diplomacy. But in the end, the debate at COP was actually about how much of that should spend on adaptation, and the doubling adaptation finance was a huge win for the vulnerable countries. But the last piece is that 100 billion is not enough to deliver 1.5. So yeah, the attention really has to shift to the trillions. So this big reform of the global financial system we saw Biden and Draghi and others talk about. Unless they deliver that, it's really hard to see how countries like Vietnam or Indonesia or India are going to shift their NDCs next year. So 100 billion, annoying, but kind of in a way over. They have to deliver it, but it's kind of in principle, but the trillions firmly where the action is on finance.
Alex, if you want to add your views.
Yeah, just briefly, I think the other cash element that came out of this COP was around what's happening with the private sector. And there was, as Iskander mentioned, a big shift in private sector commitment around net zero. But what isn't clear yet is exactly how the accountability and integrity and credibility of that private sector cash shifting will be managed. We did have the UN Secretary General pick up this agenda and is now going to bring forward this expert group to really manage what does it look like to ensure the integrity of some of these commitments coming from the private sector as well. The other cash element that did come out of the COP was a strong commitment to doubling adaptation finance, which is that bigger recognition of the need to ensure support and solidarity with climate vulnerable countries to deal with the impacts of climate change. Never enough. If we're not on that 1.5 degree pathway, the scale of finance that will be needed to deal with adaptation and manage the losses and damages of climate change is going to be astronomical. But there was an inch forward in the commitment of how cash will be mobilized for dealing with the impacts of climate change.
So Alex, just a very short extra question. So doubling on the adaptation, what sums we are talking about, what has been done up to now, and what doubling in real money means?
So the commitment in the final Glasgow Climate Pact is to double climate finance on 2019 levels finance for adaptation on 2019 levels by 2025. the OECD reports showed us that 2019 levels were about $20 billion of finance for adaptation. So doubling would mean 40, I'm looking at Iskander, who can correct me if I'm getting any of these numbers wrong, would mean around 40 billion by 2025.
Yes, so that's absolutely the numbers we're talking about. So a doubling of 2019, 20 billion to 40 billion or more, actually, depending on how you account for some of the stuff that counts for both mitigation and adaptation. So getting close to 50 billion. But yeah, 40 billion was the implicit understanding between ministers, but it's important to note that it actually wasn't a number mentioned in the text. The text only used the term doubling on current levels, but it's that 20 and 40 that was the implicit understanding as discussed by countries behind those tools.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. I'm very conscious of the time. We've got just a few minutes left. So I think that there are many, many more questions, well, certainly that I have, and probably a lot of my colleagues as well, because you've touched on so many points that invite more questioning. But given that we've got about 3 minutes, can I ask each of the experts on the panel to give us their view of whether the COP26 was a success or not? And why?
I'll go first. I think it was as successful as it probably could have been, given the really terrible global politics we were moving into. And to be honest, the lack of seriousness most countries have taken. And I think the reason I have more hope is that when the leaders arrived, it finally became clear that they got the scale and transformational approach and existential risk they face. So they've been given one more chance to show that kind of perception and realization turns into real action by 2022. And then we'll know exactly what they're prepared to do in terms of keeping people safe and how much risk they want the world to take. So that's what it had to do. It put the question is now with the countries. It's not the UNCCC's fault. It's countries who will decide how much temperature we have to put up with into the future and how they're going to help each other to deal with it. And that is why it's such a showdown moment next year in Sharm El Sheikh.
Camilla, do you want to
comment? I think I would agree with that from a coal diplomacy point of view. I think there have been some good successes at Glasgow, but a lot of that success is success on the page, and it now needs to be sort of pushed out into the sort of real world, and using the COP presidency to do that, but also the other international mechanisms and bilateral mechanisms. I mean, whether we're talking G7, G20, things like the Energy Transition Council, etc. So there's lots of work to be done, but I think we've got some good hooks now that we can kind of take forward and put additional pressure on countries to come up with a pathway out of coal. Thanks.
Iskander, if you're there, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so I would say to the question, I would say it's a punt in the American sense. It essentially makes commitments on a number of grounds, particularly in finance, and the next 12 to 24 months will be absolutely pivotal in delivering those. And so the test of Glasgow will be in whether these commitments are delivered, particularly in financial terms. Thus far, past precedent is not very confidence inspiring. So what we would need to see is something truly going beyond past precedent.
Thank you. And Alex?
And I have to say, I think it's unequivocally a diplomatic success to have got this clear commitment to how to work faster in the next 24 months to get us on that pathway to 1.5 degrees, but the COP itself hasn't put us on that pathway to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So whether or not it's successful in doing that, we will have to judge in 2 years' time when we see what action has been committed.
Thank you. You're all very diplomatic. Well-ish. Thank you so much for being with us. This was really, really useful, and I hope that all my colleagues on the Zoom call found it as useful as certainly I did. We have this afternoon a briefing with the government on COP26, as you all know, FPA members, I mean. So we follow UK lobby rules there. So I'll just remind you, please send me your questions in time. And I think this was really, really crucial for us to be able to prepare ourselves even better for that briefing later on, which will be slightly different, slightly less independent minded, and we'll see what the difference in the responses are. It will be interesting for us to see. Thank you so much once again, and see you very soon.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.